Hello and welcome to Hazard and Hope. I'm Ed, and in this episode we're looking at the range of different ways that you can design and adapt a kitchen to be more flood resilient. So here we go. This episode of Hazard and Hope is sponsored by the Scottish Flood Forum. So first things first, why would you need to make your kitchen flood resilient? When a property does flood, the kitchen can be one of the most extensively damaged parts of a building and can take longer to repair and actually be one of the main reasons why people might have to find alternative accommodation for weeks and months on end. But really it doesn't have to be this way, and there are a myriad of different ways that we can design and adapt kitchens to be more flood resilient and much more able to cope if flooding does happen. And as you can see from this one in Cumbria, there are some really beautiful examples of flood resilient kitchens out there. In many cases like this, you wouldn't actually know that it's been designed to function and perform in this way as a flood resilient kitchen, but if a flood were to occur here, you can see the drawers can be removed, you've got the oven raised high and the sockets, and they've minimised the exposure of the items within the kitchen and made many of the elements as water compatible as possible. Now in this episode we're going to be looking specifically at the actual components and items within the kitchen itself, rather than the surrounding walls and floors, but we will be bringing out an episode on how to make your walls and floors more flood resilient shortly, so do stay tuned for that. However, before we dive into discussing various strategies, it is really important to remember that any approach needs to be designed to suit its specific flood risk context and the property setup, as well as, of course, the needs of the people who are actually using it. And the best way to actually work out what these would be is to follow the process that's set out in the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience. And as you can see here, the process is structured around 6 distinct stages. And we have actually made an episode that gives a bit of a sort of overview of the Code of Practice, which you might find useful. But essentially, the first stage is the hazard assessment, and that helps us understand the particular flood risk context. And I suppose more about the potential flood depths, what the frequency of events may be, and potentially the length of time that water may end up remaining in the property. And this information can really help inform the levels at which particular items might be positioned in the kitchen, its overall layout, and what types of materials you may well choose to use. And next you have the property survey, which actually looks at what the current levels of flood resilience might be in the building. It provides information on some of the detailed design around property flood resilience measures, and it can really help to bring together and define what the property owners and user requirements may be. And this information on the flood hazard and the property survey really then feeds in to help inform the next stage, which is options development and design. And from this point, we can then start actually looking at different design strategies for adaptation and resilience. Now, obviously with something like a kitchen, a key factor for consideration that influences the particular approach and specification is the style and type of kitchen that you have or that you'd like to create. It can actually be that in particular flood risk contexts or particular property setups that certain approaches would be more vulnerable to damage in the event of a flood and therefore may actually be less appropriate. But really it comes down to the manner in which you or the kitchen's users themselves may want to use that space and plan for its future functionality. Now, when we think about how we can design a kitchen to be more flood resilient, we're going to consider this in relation to the various components that you can see here. So to begin with, let's look at the kitchen cabinets and the carcasses themselves. Now, things like compressed wood and chipboard laminate carcasses can in particular very easily swell and distort when they come into contact with floodwater. They'll lose their structural integrity and potentially require removal and reinstatement after a flood. And actually, if the end boards or the structure of the carcass is actually sitting on the floor, then even a shallow depth of floodwater could seep, soak and spread upwards through that board, through that material. So what can we do to adapt? Well, we might actually change the material of the cabinets. So you can see here an example of Claire's kitchen where she's got solid hardwood kitchen cabinets. Now, for long duration of flood events, this can still soak up some flood water, but for the majority of shorter durations, it will perform better than its compressed chipboard counterparts. Now, marine ply is also a material that could be specified for this purpose, and there are also cabinets made from composites such as acrylic, resin and recycled materials that are worth considering. You can see here an example of this type of composite kitchen carcass on display at the Resilient Repair Home, the BRE in Watford. Or it may even be that you actually specify a metal stainless steel kitchen. Now, that could be something which you more often than not see in a commercial context. And you can see here Lisa, who runs the Blue Teapot Cafe, has gone for this type of approach. But I have also seen a number of different examples of these types of stainless steel kitchens being fitted into a residential context, and you can see here an example of Tim's house in Kent where he's got one. Now, as well as changing the actual materials, we may also plan for a change in the position of the cabinets and the carcasses. It can, for example, make sense to locate more storage in wall-hung cupboards at high level, so really essentially they're out of harm's way and less exposed to floodwater. Actually, one tip with the cabinets is that it can make sense to have a little gap and space between the cabinets and the wall, which can help with ventilation and drying after a flood. But it could also be that you actually choose to use and specify a type of kitchen cabinet or storage that can be actually easily disassembled or even moved prior to a flood event. And many of these types of approaches can also apply to the actual cabinet doors themselves. So these might well be made of more water compatible materials, such as hardwood, marine ply, or different composites, but it could actually be that the cabinet doors or the drawers are designed with quick release latches on them so that they can be removed prior to a flood event and actually relocated to a lower risk part of the property. And as I mentioned earlier, the actual way in which the cabinets meet the ground is also an important aspect to consider. So you might well look to use things like metal or plastic legs, or even have kickboards which are easy to remove in the case of a flood. Alternatively, you might actually choose to make the units wall mounted, so they don't actually need legs at all. Or you might actually have them as freestanding beneath the worktop so they can be quickly and easily moved out before a flood. Next, let's look at worktops. Now, just like the cabinets, if these are made of materials that aren't water compatible, then they can swell and distort when they come into contact with floodwater. But when it comes to actual strategies, really any of the flood resilient materials that we've discussed in relation to the actual carcasses and the cabinets themselves could be considered here. But it may of course be that you actually look to specify something like a stone, marble or granite worktop, which would be less affected by floodwater. Alternatively, it could be that you actually design the worktops themselves to be quick and easy to release and move prior to a flood event. So again, that's a kind of avoidance-based approach. Next, let's look at furniture. Now, in the event of a flood, you may not have time or space to move items into other rooms or up to higher level. So when it comes to the type of furniture that we actually find in a kitchen, I think there's a number of things to consider here. Now, you might choose to have something like a dining table or chairs that could be quick and easy to fold or disassemble prior to a flood event. It might actually be that you have a breakfast bar set at higher level with stainless steel legs. It might also be that you actually choose to specify tables and chairs made of water compatible materials that are very sturdy, and that in the event of a flood you can lift items up onto them and stack things out of harm's way. Now, things like chairs, it can be a real bonus if they are able to be stacked, but obviously something like fitted seating can be difficult to move and could well be inundated and require ripping out post-flood. And really this kind of resilient mindset and thinking needs to run through all scales, and it goes right down to the way in which you store the actual food and items within the kitchen itself. Sue, for example, makes sure that she actually only has metal tins of food at lower level within her cupboards, and the other items that might be vulnerable to floodwater are in plastic sealed boxes so that if or when a flood were to occur, they can be really quickly and easily moved. Next, let's look at the actual electrical items and white goods, as these obviously feature within kitchens and are frequently flood damaged devices and can be expensive to replace. Now again, going back to first principles, what we want to do is to reduce the exposure of as many items that we can to flood risk. So actually elevating these different objects and devices can be a really smart move. You can, for example, get dishwashers which fit into waist height drawers so they're up out of harm's way, or you might actually choose to raise your washing machine or fridge on a plinth, or actually even locate it in a lower risk part of the property or even off-site entirely. In a commercial setting, it might actually be that you choose to move the items themselves. For example, Lisa at the Blue Teapot Cafe, when she gets a flood warning, she actually rolls many of her large fridges and freezers out of the building and up to a safe, lower risk location. Now, that might not be feasible in every context, but really thinking ahead about how you minimize the risk and damage to these items is crucial. Another approach is actually to think about how you can make it so that it's really easy to actually remove and elevate the items themselves. You can see, for example, in Claire's kitchen here that she actually unplugs and lifts her dishwasher up on metal trellises before a flood so it can stay up and above that floodwater level. Now, I hope in the coming years that we can see many examples of white goods that can be flood recoverable, but for now I would say that we should be favouring an avoidance-based approach when it comes to this type of adaptation. Now, that said, it might actually be that the flood risk to the property is really very low indeed, and instead you choose to invest your time and energy into making the actual cabinets and kitchen itself more flood recoverable. Whilst I suppose accepting that, if any of the white goods are damaged, then these will need to be replaced, but it doesn't have to mean that the whole kitchen has to be necessarily ripped out and reinstated. And so really, again, it comes back to choice and prioritising how you want to live in and use that space. Now, when it comes to the actual electrics for these devices, it can make sense to have sockets positioned higher with wiring fed from the ceiling down. Again, just to minimise the actual exposure of these systems and items to floodwater. And following on from that, it is really important to consider actually what can be done to the plumbing and drainage systems in a kitchen to make it more flood resilient. Because when we think about the points of water entry in a building, we need to remember that floodwater can really easily backflow and surcharge through these networks. So in those contexts where this is a risk, then it can make a lot of sense to have something like a non-return valve fitted on maybe washing machines, sinks, dishwashers, and different drainage feeds. And these essentially make it so that wastewater can only flow in one direction. So as the floodwaters rise, they don't backflow through the system and flood you through your sinks or through your washers. And to be doubly safe, there are also things like bungs that can be fitted to provide a second point of protection. It might also be that you position things like your radiator at higher level, or make it easy to detach and have your boiler mounted on the wall or even on an entirely different floor of the building. And I suppose another aspect relating to these different systems is to be really careful when it comes to making any holes within the building fabric itself, because whether that be for plumbing or wiring, these can be a potential point of water entry, and where possible we should be putting them in at higher level. And I suppose if that's not feasible, then you can seal the joints, but it is important to check that these haven't degraded over time or been damaged by things like frost or the floodwater itself. Now, we've covered many of the kind of individual strategies when it comes to the specification of materials and devices, but I suppose a larger question that may also be worth reviewing is actually where you locate the kitchen within the property as a whole. Especially if you're rebuilding after a flood. It can be a good, albeit difficult time to make this kind of major change. Again, this ties back into understanding the flood risk context and the property setup, as you need to consider how frequent and deep that floodwater may be. Tim, for example, whose home I mentioned earlier, he actually moved his main kitchen area up from the ground floor to the first floor. Now, we've looked at many of the different approaches that you might consider in stage 3 of the Code of Practice, the options development and design stage, but stages 4, 5 and 6 are also crucial to be aware of, as these relate to the construction, the commissioning and handover, and operation and maintenance. And these stages are intended to provide clarity and assurance that really any measures that have been installed have been fitted correctly, and the actual home or business owner knows how to use and operate and maintain these. And that aspect of maintenance is key to consider at the design stage, as we need to think ahead and actually work out how that kitchen could well be designed to be really easily cleaned and decontaminated if a flood were to occur. And ultimately, as the Code of Practice points out, any strategy should be proportional and designed to actually suit the specific context and way in which the home or business owner themselves would like to live in, use and inhabit that space. And I suppose the sort of takeaway from all of this is that really flood resilient design doesn't have to be a compromise to the style or function of a kitchen. If you remember that beautiful kitchen that we saw at the beginning of this episode, I think that there's some wonderful examples out there, and it doesn't have to be that it sticks out like a sore thumb. I would say do bear in mind these different types of strategies that we've gone through in this episode, as it might well be that you're looking to do a refurbishment, or you could be designing a new build property, or actually having your home reinstated after a flood, because these types of approaches could really save you and all the property's owners, occupiers, a huge amount of heartache, disruption, waste and expense, and not to mention actually provide peace of mind in knowing that really things have been prepared and planned for accordingly. And as I said, the process to follow in doing this can be found in the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience, and we have actually put a link to the guidance for this in the description just below this video. And hopefully we can see many more examples of some really beautiful and functional flood resilient kitchens. So thanks very much for listening, and if you'd like to keep updated on future episodes, then please subscribe below, hit the bell for notifications, and we look forward to seeing you soon.